All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Lily. I use she and they pronouns. And I work right now for the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, but I'm kind of doing this on my own time because I love advocacy and I love talking about policy and bringing it back to the people. For some context, I myself got really involved in policy because I grew up in the foster care system and I experienced homelessness as a young person. And so I really wanted to see some changes. And so I got really involved in figuring out how to do that for people who come from backgrounds like me. So I always say, like, no matter where you come from, if you're passionate about policymaking, you can always be a part of the policy process, right? And in fact, it's your legislators' jobs to really make sure that you're there and that your voices are represented in lawmaking. But that being said, there are some tips and tricks and some processes that people should have some background on before you get into it, right? Especially as you all are about to go through your legislative priorities and your advocacy agenda. So these are just some tips and tricks. I welcome any and all questions. No question is too big, no question too small. And please feel free to ask us as we're going. You can either use the chat or you can come off of mute. I'm fine with both. And I want to make this more of a conversation. So this is about the 2023 legislative session. And this is just a really quick overview. So here's some quick terminology just so that we all know. Washington State Legislature, when I say that, it's just the process or what the process or the body of people is called, right? So like between when we say the Washington State Legislature, we're talking about the collective people who are driving this process. When we say citizen legislature, and that is what Washington State has, a citizen state legislature, it means that it's part-time members who have other jobs. So that means that there's only a certain part of the year where we're actually making laws, and then the other parts of the years we're not making laws. But then there are some states in the United States that have full-time legislatures, like you can look at California. For example, they have a full-time legislature. That's their only job, is to make laws all year round, right? Whereas in Washington, our legislature usually have like other jobs. You'll often see people who work in nonprofits or people who have their own business. There's a lot of dentists in the legislature. And that's just, that's just what they do. They're citizen legislature. When I say session, I'm just talking about the time frame to pass bills. So since we're in a long session, I'm going to be talking about January to April. That's kind of the time frame that we have. And then when I talk about budgets, we're going to talk about money, because one of the things you'll learn is that you can have the best policy in the world, but if you don't have the money to support it, we don't know if it's actually going to work, right? I'm not going to play this video, but this is a really good resource. I can't recommend TVW enough. It is a site that is publicly accessible. Washington State has a really great library of resources that are publicly maintained and really accessible. And TVW really talks about how a bill can become a law. And thank you, Tristan. You can go ahead and share that in the email. But that being said, so when we talk about this session in particular, we're talking about what's called a long session, right? So right now, when the 2023 session starts, we're going to have 105 days to pass all the laws that people want to come up with, right? So when we talk about regular session, we're talking odd number years. That's a long session, so that's 105 days. And then even number years, that's called a short session, and that's only 60 days. This is what's called a cutoff calendar. This tells you kind of how long you have. You'll notice that this is from 2020. The 2023 one has not been produced yet. That usually comes out a week or so after session starts, and session will always start the second Tuesday of January. So this year, I believe it starts on the, the 10th. It'll start on the 10th of January. And then it'll go for 105 days. So that being said, there's kind of a journey, there's a little bit of a process that a bill has to take before it can actually become law, right? And this is like, so this is like kind of like a flow chart of like what that looks like. That's very like reduced down to its basics. So say that you wanted to pass a bill, for example, you have a policy idea about, like I want to see LGBTQ plus curriculum included in like sex education. That's just like one bill that I know that has gone through this journey. So you start with the House of Origin. You need to find a champion either on the House side, and those are your representatives, or you need to find a champion on the Senate side, and those are your senators. Every district, every legislative district in Washington state has 2 representatives and 1 senator. So you'll see that breakdown happen. So once you find your champion, you'll then go to the policy committee, right? And so that means that it's gonna find its way into how it relates to larger themes, right? So for like the example of sex education, that would go into like a House Education Committee, right? That kind of bill would go into House Education Committee. And it's a policy committee. So we're not talking about money yet. We're strictly talking about, what does the bill say? Let's say that everybody on that committee likes it. It looks great. It's going to move on to its next place called the Financial Committee. So for example, if you were on the House side, that would be appropriations. And if you were on the Senate side, that would be Ways and Means. So we're not debating the policy anymore. What we're debating now is how much is this going to cost? And is this a reasonable cost? Say everybody's like, okay, this cost doesn't seem substantial. We like the policy. We're going to move it on to what's called the Rules Committee. So the Rules Committee, and this is actually really important since you all are from Pierce County, is what the leadership. So the people who, like, for example, the Speaker of the House, the Majority Whip, like all of these people who kind of gather the collective votes of the representatives, they're the people who kind of decide what goes to the floor to actually be voted on. So because you all are in Pierce County, you all have the privilege of potentially being represented by or having close proximity to Speaker Lori Jenkins. So when you go to advocate, and if you are in Speaker Jenkins' legislative district, I myself am in Speaker Jenkins' legislative district, really emphasize that, because a lot of bills actually don't end up on the floor because it really depends on what this leadership committee prioritizes. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to really rep where you're from, because people will pay attention to that. But say that the leadership committee is like, okay, this is good, we're going to put it on the floor to vote. The House of Origin takes the vote, right? So for example, this is going to be the House. So so all the representatives get a chance to vote on it. And in the House of Representatives specifically, they have a little button that they can press, whether they want to do it or whether they don't. And say that if it all passes, so say that we got the votes that we needed, it'll now go through the opposite chamber. So since this originated in the House, it's now going to go to the Senate. Okay. And it's going to go through the same process. It's going to go through the Senate policy, and it's going to go through the Senate Financial Committee, right? And say everybody agrees with that, right? And often what you'll see too, to like make this process easier, is you'll see companion bills. So they're going through the same time, so everybody understands what that means, right? So that you're not having to take more time doing, because things get rushed at the end, right? So say everybody says, okay, this is good. Now the opposite chamber will vote. So in the Senate, they'll take a vote and say if that passes, that's when it gets to go to the desk for the governor to sign. So bills in and of themselves kind of take kind of a journey. It's not just like, oh, I have this great idea and I'm gonna, and it's just gonna become law. It has to go through this very structured journey. And I'm gonna pause there. Are there any questions about the journey of a bill that I can answer for you all? I know that this is not the most reasonable explanation or graph. So if you have any lingering questions, I'm happy to hear.
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
So are these in these various committees, are there opportunities for legislators to vote every single time?
No. So are you talking about a full body? Like the
Oh
full,
yeah, I guess that's so like how do we know that it's advancing through these committees?
yeah. So thank you so much for that. So when for example, if it's in a policy committee, right? So usually you have to really pay attention to who's in charge of that committee. And it's usually like a small percentage of like the larger body is going to be on that committee. So like, for example, with I think a lot about like health and human services, because like that's the committee I pay attention to a lot. Senator Wilson is kind of the chair of that, right? And so whatever she says gets kind of on the agenda. But she also works with her what's called the ranking member. So that's the opposite party's leadership as well in that committee. So they work together to figure out what gets a hearing, right? So policy committee will often have like hearings, public hearings. So this is where you get to come and you get to testify. And then from those public hearings, they'll decide what goes to what's called executive session. So, and you'll hear the word exec out, right? So from there, that executive session, that's where that committee specifically will vote on whether or not it's going to the next committee, which is the financial committee, right? And then in the financial committee, you'll have the same thing where you'll hear public hearings, right? And then they will also take an executive vote as well to move to the rules committee and then to the chamber. So it's a small percentage of each body that gets to vote, and there isn't like a collective vote until it goes to the floor.
And then is it by majority or does it have to be unanimous?
Yeah, it's by majority.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. You want it to be you want it to be bipartisan, right? Like you would like to have both parties have enthusiasm over it, but sometimes it does fall on party lines. Other questions? For some of you that are in that AP history, this is history lived, right? So I always think about like 1,000 years from now, what will people say about our democracy? Will my flow chart make it into the anthropological archive? Probably not. But this is like democracy in action, right? Like this is what we get remembered for. It are these processes. So the legislature only acts through bills, right? So the written law, like the legislature's job is to basically revise it, if you would. Like think of them as like master copy editors, right? Like they're the people going through trying to figure out what the right wording and trying to figure out, as things change, how can we adapt laws so that they're more reflective of like the current state of being, right? So when you're reading a bill, if it's underlined, right, like that's the language that's been new or added. And if you're seeing a strike through the language, that's the changes to the language. That will be the it no longer applies. So if you all go through drafts, like that's essentially how you read it, is through that way. And I say that the legislature only acts through bills, but it also acts through budgets as well. So you may not need necessarily a written law, but maybe they say that they want to provide funding for something, for like a project. That's called a budget proviso. So it acts through bills and it acts through money, right?
And we are actually proposing a budget proviso this year to support this very program. So our members will be learning more about that later.
And the cool thing is that you don't have to go through policy committee.
Yeah, it's very
nice. You just
nice.
get to kind of jump a step if you're just going through a budget proviso.
Yeah.
I also see some chat. Yes. Okay. So this is what it takes to make a law, right? 50 representatives plus 25 senators plus 1 governor. That's the numbers game if you're playing that. And then this is just kind of a showing you, this was taken during a long session, but there are a lot of bills that get introduced during legislative session. Because like I said before, we are a part-time citizen legislature. And so that means that when session does happen, there's usually like a backlog of things that really need to get done. So for example, in 2019, the House introduced 1,400 bills, the Senate introduced 1,300. A lot of these are companions, but sometimes people have different ideas about how the policy should be written. But out of that, this is what passed the House was 480. And then what passed the opposite chamber was only 268, right? And then from the Senate side, 480 passed out of the Senate, but then only 211 made it out of the House. So total bills, it's like 2,700. And then total bills passed was 479, but that means that only 17% of all bills that were introduced actually passed and made it into law. So I will just say this, a lot of policy doesn't make it to the end, but what you have been seeing in recent years is you've been seeing a lot of people being willing to introduce things in the short session, and in the long session, especially if that policy didn't make it into law, it doesn't immediately die. In fact, it automatically gets turned over in the short session. It's not until it goes through a long session and a short session does that policy die. So you have some time to make it up, but it does take time. Yeah, it's wild. Thanks for that. These stats always get me. Yeah, same for me as well. Are there ever opposing bills that are fighting for opposite of another going through the process at the same time? Yeah, so there's oftentimes what sometimes will happen is people who disagree with some of the policy will present their own policy. And it really comes down to the people who chair those committees to decide what version of the bill moves forward. You'll also see people proposing their own amendments to the bills as well as they're going through these committees or once they end up on the floor. And truthfully, these chair people, right, they really are guided by lobbyists, they're guided by advocates, they're guided by people like you, like their constituents, right? To decide what is the best route for the policy that's being proposed. So they pay attention to who's signing in favor and who's signing in opposed to a lot of this legislation, as well as they're really paying attention to the work that was done before the session happened around the specific policy. So yeah, so it does, there are times where things come into conflict. And sometimes what they'll also say too, if it's pretty split, is they'll say it's not going to make it to the floor because there isn't consensus, right? Like people don't want to vote on something that they're not certain about. So they're going to say, hey, community, you need to figure this out before it comes into law again. And that's happened a couple times, right? But nothing too controversial, I don't think. Like sometimes it's like the party that's responsible. That's usually what gets debated about. So budgets. Okay, now we're going to talk about money, because one of the things to know about money is that it really drives a lot of policy that we see, right? So in long sessions, which is what we're about to go through, we have what's called an operating budget being developed, a transportation budget being developed, and a capital, otherwise known as like a building budget, being developed. So the operating budget is a big bill. It's a big bill. It originates out of the Appropriations Committee. It originates out of the Ways and Means Committee, so from the House and the Senate. And then also the governor will create their own version of an operating. So these three need to then be reconciled. And once they all agree on how money is going to be spent, that's then the operating budget, right? So it's a big bill. It comes with a lot of money. And this session in particular, people were told this was supposed to be what's called a governor's legacy budget. So this means that Inslee's trying to go out with a bang, right? Like he's trying to say, like, we're going to invest a lot of money into X, Y, and Z. But that being said, there's been a lot of conversation about impending recession. happening. And so what we actually thought was going to be a big operating budget might actually be leaner because people don't want to spend money in time of recession, in anticipation of recession. So you're going to see a lot of really interesting things maybe getting cut and you're going to see a lot of people being like, can we bring that price down? Because of that political dynamic that's currently happening. Transportation budget sounds exactly like it sounds. So anything related to infrastructure around transportation, that's going to also be being built at the time. And then capital is just basically like the brick and mortar buildings. So in order for government to function, how we need to build, buildings that house people to work, right? That hasn't been as like big this time around because there's been like COVID has really created like a work from home flexibility environment. So capital budgets, I don't anticipate is going to be big, but it is a big expenditure because it does cost money to build buildings, right? And then in short sessions, we have what's called a supplemental budget. So anything that got missed in the long session, that's the opportunity to kind of build it back into those three budgets. And that is kind of the Wild West of kind of whatever ends up in that budget, whatever ends up there, right? The longer session is a little bit more scripted and a little bit more detailed. And then, like I said before, excuse me, the House, the Senate, and the governor's office will all produce versions of these budgets. And then they have to agree upon it. And then the agreed upon final version between all three chambers will be the final version that actually gets implemented. Any questions about budgets? I know that money can be kind of confusing. And that's where you'll see your budget proviso is in these versions. So they'll like release like 1,000-page document. They're not very fun to read, but that's where you'll see how much money is going into your proviso. And you want to be checking all three versions. So you want to be checking the Senate's version, you want to be checking the House version, and you want to be checking the governor's because they can differentiate. And if there's differentiation, that's not good. You want it to be consistent all the way through the three. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Oh, I guess I'm done. So, and then these are helpful resources for tracking information. So if you're looking for like just a basic overview, you can go to ledge.wa.gov. I highly encourage you all to go to ledge.wa.gov because it's a great website. And actually Washington State is really blessed that we have this. I've worked federally and not all states are as transparent as Washington State with their legislative process. It's actually a pain I have to actually physically call people when I was working federally and working specifically in Pennsylvania, I had to call people. It's very weird, but we do have this resource, so I consider you all to use it. Budget. This is the governor will release their budget on the website, and this is where budget issue/budget. And then this is also how you can testify. Since it is been COVID has really allowed us to have a real hybrid model in terms of testimony. So if you are called to testify on a policy or money, exactly. You kind of have more of flexible options now. You don't necessarily have to be in person, which is great. It's shown a lot more citizen participatory participation throughout this whole state, whereas that was an equity issue before. Cutoff calendar, that's important because it tells you when things are due. And the cutoff calendar is important because if you miss those dates, you can't go backwards, right? So pay attention to that. And then TVW is here, and then Teach with TVW is here as well. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Are there any questions that I can answer? No? Okay. You all are going to get an A++ on the Kahoot.